Today in History. Okay, now let's take a look at what interesting thing happened on this day in the past.
Indeed. First, as always, the quiz question, though. After the period so-called the Roaring Twenties came, number one, the Great Depression, or number two, the Shallow Thirties. So, reworded, the question, what do we call the period following the Roaring Twenties? Number one, the Great Depression, or number two, the Shallow Thirties. If you know the answer, you can put it on our Bandi board or text in pounder sharp 1045 for 51 to win a designer's note.
Is it just me or is it a little bit more difficult than other times, I think?
It's a tough question today. Yeah.
Roaring 20s. 이게 또 뭔지 알아야 되겠네요. 그죠? All right, so let's go and check out what significant events happened on this day in the past.
Today in history. In 1787, the opera Don Giovanni was first performed, and in 1929, the Great Depression started.
1787년 10월 29일 오페라 Don Giovanni가 초연을 펼친 날이고요. 또 1929년 10월 29일은 미국의 대공황, 그야말로 The Great Depression이 시작된 날입니다.
So we start today's journey to the past with one of the most renowned operas in the world.
Composed by the one and only Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, the opera was Don Giovanni, put on stage for the first time on this day in 1787.
Now, Don Giovanni blends elements of comedy, melodrama, and the supernatural, and it is, to date, one of the most performed operas of all time.
Based on the legendary character Don Juan, which can be traced back to the 14th century, Don Giovanni was the inspiration to many other famous works, as well as an influence to real-life figures such as Giacomo Casanova.
What's more, the opera captivated writers such as George Bernard Shaw, as well as renowned French novelist Gustave Flaubert, to catalog Don Giovanni as one of the finest things ever made.
Well, however, Don Giovanni's greatest influence was felt in the music spheres, where prominent musicians such as Franz Liszt, Beethoven, Chopin, and Tchaikovsky drew inspiration from the scores and lyrics of Mozart's masterpiece.
Yeah, pretty good. I've never seen it, but I would like to. Worth checking out. All right, so now let's go to the 20th century when an event took place on this day, pardon me, that changed the course of history.
And that was the so-called Black Tuesday, or the crash of the market on October 29th in 1929.
Right. Now, the devastating collapse of the U.S. stock market marked the beginning of what was known as the Great Depression, a decade-long worldwide economic depression that put a deep dent in the world's economy, especially those dependent on heavy industry.
Well, preceded by the affluent Roaring 20s, the Great Depression lasted until the late 30s to mid-40s.
That's right. I actually was watching a documentary last week that was drawing equivalencies between the Great Depression and the economic depression that we are going through currently, the one that started around 2008.
Oh, so were they talking about a lot of resemblances there?
Yes, exactly. A lot of
그래요?
things were equivalent.
That's scary.
Yeah, it is kind of scary, actually. I hope they aren't right in that documentary. Anyway, that's going to do it for Today in History. But before we finish things up, the answer to the quiz question. The question was, what do we call the period following the Roaring Twenties? The answer? The Great Depression.
그걸 The Roaring Twenties라고 하는군요. 막 울부짖는 막 와 하는 그런 20년대.
It was a time of economic strength.
Right, the affluent. 굉장히 그때 부유했고 모든 것이 풍부했던 그런 20년대 이어서 대공황이 찾아왔다라는 것이 되겠습니다.
And that will be it for Today in History. We'll be back tomorrow with more from the past.